History as it happens, August 16, 2022. Slavery and the Constitution.
There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem.
When President Johnson called on Americans to unite to defeat the legacies of slavery, racism, and injustice by backing the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he invoked the nation's history and fate and the unending search for freedom. His words resonate in our divided society today as we argue over the meaning of our founding and the hypocrisy of the founders. The Heritage Foundation says our past is under attack by the very institutions that exist to preserve it. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And once you start having that conversation about why and how it's possible for us to have this revelation, right, about every human person being equal and that slavery is a stain on America, we then start looking at history on its terms.
Every year for my birthday in September, I visit Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's mountaintop plantation in Virginia. That is where the primary author of the Declaration of Independence enslaved some 600 human beings during his long life. Jefferson died at the age of 83 on July 4th, 1826. The same day John Adams died in one of the most remarkable coincidences in history. My annual sojourns to Charlottesville have been more illuminating, more satisfying, since I read Annette Gordon Reed's The Hemings of Monticello a few years ago. Her book reveals Jefferson's private, human world and the lives of the slaves he ruled. Among them, Sally Hemings, with whom Jefferson had several children, as the available evidence suggests. This is the fifth installment of my occasional series on slavery and the Constitution. Each episode's had a slightly different focus. All are connected to the ongoing reckoning over race and the so-called history wars over the meaning of the American founding. The first episode came out in February with Joseph Ellis. You can search for all of them wherever you find this podcast. My personal favorite was the April episode with Sean Wilentz and James Oakes. This episode is landing as the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank in Washington, released a report on the exhibits at three presidential estates: George Washington's Mount Vernon, James Madison's Montpelier, and Jefferson's Monticello. At the latter two, the report found Madison's and Jefferson's accomplishments have been erased by an overemphasis on slavery and race. We're going to talk about that with the Heritage Foundation president, historian Kevin Roberts.
As a civil society, we recognize that his presidency was very important. His writing the Declaration was very important, including to him. And neither is presented with any balance anymore at Monticello.
I mentioned Annette Gordon Reed's work before in her final chapter on the estate sale to cover Jefferson's enormous personal debts after he died. A sale advertised in newspapers in late 1826 as consisting of things like furniture and livestock and 130 valuable Negroes. Gordon Reed writes, "It was a national tragedy, the natural result of America's engagement with the institution of slavery, the doctrine of white supremacy, and the nature of human frailty. The relationship of the Hemingses to the tragedy of slavery was unique only because they happened to be owned by one who made himself a public man, but wanted to keep private the world he really lived in with this particular African-American enslaved family. There is deep irony in this, too," writes Gordon Reed. "What Jefferson accomplished for his children and some of their relatives was just what he stated could not be accomplished in the nation as a whole." And what she means there is the Hemingses were given freedom, but the rest of Jefferson's slaves faced the auction block. And as Gordon Reed writes elsewhere, the post-revolutionary enthusiasm for the rights of man that had created a critique of slavery had long faded by the 1820s. And Jefferson's Virginia was already well on its way toward a full embrace of pro-slavery ideology. Jefferson discerned early on in his career that no matter what some members of his society said about the evils of slavery, a legislative abolition of the institution in Virginia and in the South as a whole was as close to a political impossibility as anything could be. Is that, the estate sale, as much a part of Jefferson's legacy as, say, his authorship of the Declaration? Now, Thomas Jefferson was many things, and at Monticello he was a despot, because slavery was a form of despotism. And although Jefferson never personally brutalized his human property, some of his overseers were violent and cruel. Despite those uncomfortable realities, I've never left Monticello unaware of Jefferson's political accomplishments or his greatness. Even if most of the exhibits and tours deal with other things like his architecture, art, inventions, and home life, after all, Monticello was his home. And whenever I'm in that amazing home, I'm less interested in the Declaration of Independence than I am the scientific artifacts on display in the entrance hall. As Monticello's website describes it, it's where visitors viewed artifacts of American natural history and American Indian cultures while they waited for a chance to greet the former president, the man who had sent Lewis and Clark on their expedition west. And one of the most moving exhibits is a new one, dedicated to Sally Hemings, who lived in the slave quarters in the mansion. Sally was the daughter of a mixed-race enslaved woman, Elizabeth Hemings, who had as many as 6 children with her owner, John Wales. That helps explain why 2 of Sally Hemings' children with Jefferson, Beverly and Eston, were so light-skinned they passed as white and lived out their lives in white society after their master's death. Sally Hemings was also the half-sister of Jefferson's deceased wife, Martha. She died in 1782. Of their 6 children, only 2 lived to adulthood. In 18th century America, death was everywhere, and that is something you learn at Monticello. All of this is to say, when I visit, I feel like I've taken a trip back into the early 19th century to peer into the lives of a remarkable family. Monticello is accomplishing its mission, at least in my view. Kevin Roberts, a historian of early America, now president of the Heritage Foundation, disagrees with me. Hello, Kevin Roberts.
Thanks for having me, Martin. It's a pleasure.
Welcome to the studio. I'm trying to get more people to come in here and say hi to me.
It's great to do this in person. You know, I started listening to your podcast recently, as I mentioned to you, so it's just a pleasure to be here with you.
All right, you're a guest and a listener. So before we dive into this heavy subject, you've been the president of Heritage Foundation for just 8 months. How do you like Washington, D.C.? Is it more humid here than it was in Texas, where you were?
Definitely more humid than in Texas, where I was, in the hill country, which is glorious. But I did grow up on the Gulf Coast, so Washington still is behind the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast in humidity.
Well, you have a Ph.D. in early American history. When you mentioned the hill country just now, I thought of Robert Caro and his LBJ volumes.
It's hard not to think about Robert Caro, or for that matter, LBJ. You know, where we lived in Liberty Hill, Texas, I would often go visit friends nearby and go through Stonewall, where the Johnson Ranch is, very important part of history. And of course, a bit of a checkered past there, but obviously for Texans, both of them are icons.
Is there a statue of LBJ at the Heritage Foundation? No, I got
that
wrong
would not
president.
be something to count on when you walk into Heritage.
Maybe Ronald Reagan. But you're nonpartisan, so
that's right.
Yeah, pardon my attempts.
Well, we love
at
good
humor.
policy, and that's why we dislike LBJ, is because of his so-called Great Society. But you're not supposed to trigger me this way. I'm
That's
supposed to
right.
be playing historian today, Martin.
Yeah, well, we're not going to get into Johnson's policies, although he does kind of loom over this whole issue, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, making the United States a multiracial democracy for the first time, or at least the first time since the experiment of Reconstruction in the South. Maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. So you did have a PhD. You still do have a PhD in history. You studied early American history and slavery, right?
That's correct. I studied at the University of Texas at Austin and had the opportunity to focus on early American history, basically any topic. But when I was doing my master's at Virginia Tech, my graduate thesis advisor, Dr. Randy Shiflett, suggested that given where I grew up in the Gulf Coast in a city that's 50% white, 50% black, that even though, as you know, because you're sitting here with me, I'm obviously a white guy, I had a very strong interest in African American culture, and that I might be interested in reading, thinking about what you just said regarding LBJ, Daniel Patrick Moynihan's report on the Black family, which he wrote as an advisor to President Johnson. That prompted my interest in the evolution of the African American family during slavery and allowed me to focus on the transatlantic slave trade, not from the standpoint of economics, as a lot of historians have done, but from the standpoint of the slaves themselves. And I'm sure we'll get into that. All of that, of course, is very much connected to modern policy in ways that not a whole lot of conservatives think about. And I think that's why it's among many other things, it's such a privilege to do what I do now for a living as a policy leader, is be able to bring to life, if you will, what I've learned through the study of history.
It's interesting. Have you been to the African American History Museum?
I have not. I, frankly, if I may, have boycotted it. because of what I see as a very irresponsible, inaccurate portrayal of history. I may go in there one day. I have a tendency to support those historic museums that portray history accurately, and I would not put that in that category.
What do you think the problem is there?
Well, the problem is that they have produced exhibits that racialize America's past, that reduce each of us to the lowest common denominator, which would be our skin color, which then means you're able to divide us according to immutable characteristics. And I find that reprehensible. I find it terrible for Black Americans. I find it terrible for white Americans. And trust me, you read anything I wrote as a professional historian, you know that I abhor the so-called whitewashing of history. So for anyone listening who thinks, oh, this is the president of Heritage, he's a white guy, he's a conservative, he wants to whitewash history, they'd be dead wrong. That museum, because of the recent exhibits in particular over the last 3 or 4 years, really does need an overhaul.
I haven't been there in a while. When I first went, I was impressed with the slavery aspects of it, but maybe I need to go back and check it out again. Maybe we'll return to the subject of museums because the Heritage Foundation is out with a report about the exhibits at Monticello, Montpelier, and Mount Vernon. I do intend to ask you about that. But we'll start off big here. As you know, I've been doing this occasional series on slavery and the Constitution to try to move past some of the stale debates we've been having in this country, some of them spurred by the 1619 Project, others by the national reckoning on race that was spurred by the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. So I thought maybe I would start at the beginning, the Constitution, if that is the beginning. Maybe 1619 is the beginning. Is the Constitution an anti-slavery or pro-slavery document in your view?
Great question and great framing. It's neither. And the fact that it's neither is really the story. That is to say, the fact that it's neither is a reflection of a couple of things about the framers of the Constitution. One of them was the reality that roughly half were from non-slave states and the other half obviously from slave states. And the second is that in order to put together this governing document that sort of implemented the principles of the Declaration of Independence, they couldn't come to an agreement on what was obviously a controversy then. And as I'm sure we'll discuss, Martin, the Constitution only mentions enslaved persons in a few areas. But to the heart of the question, what the Constitution allowed was for this country that did have slavery to be able on its own accord, without large external influence, to free slaves. Granted, it took 70 years. There's no intention to whitewash anything here. I'm a guy who has brought to life, if you will, the lives of enslaved persons. But the point is that the Constitution ought to be credited for at least not being pro-slavery.
I see it as a contested document. I've adopted James Oakes' language in that regard. Sean Wilentz as well has written a marvelous book, No Property in Man, that goes after the notion that the Constitution established property in man, human chattel slavery as a federal institution. He says the country was not founded on slavery. Obviously, slavery predated the writing of the Constitution. Do you agree with that contested document?
Oh, I do. I think that's a real good description. And both of those historians, by the way, were instrumental in my own work. Sean Wilentz, in the book that you mentioned, I think provides a very persuasive case. And Wilentz, who's an extremely nice fellow, as you know, is certainly no conservative.
He's on the left, as is Oakes.
They're both on the left. And you know, when I was in graduate school a generation ago, 25 years ago, I was conservative then too, and all of my advisors shared the politics of those great scholars, Oakes and Wilentz. All of that to say, this really shouldn't be portrayed, as we're apt to do in the 21st century, as a liberal or conservative thing. What historians ought to bring to the debate is what the text says and the context of the text, and I think that Oakes and Wilentz, for my professional judgment as a historian of early America, are some of the finest scholars around.
Well, the issue of slavery inside the Constitution, the word slavery doesn't appear. It's persons committed to involuntary labor, something like that.
Euphemisms are used.
Yeah, euphemisms are used. Wilentz argues that wasn't done to try to fool anybody, because obviously everyone knew who they were referring to. It was done on purpose by Madison and others so that there would be no property in man as a federal institution.
He's 100% correct. And as I have explained to, I guess, thousands of students, even though I'm no longer in the classroom, the real key part of the Constitution that focuses on enslaved persons, that tells us that the framers were laying the groundwork for America one day to become an entity, a society that had no slavery, was the clause that ended the transatlantic slave trade. as of January 1st, 1808. You can tell me how much you want to go into the weeds. This happens to be, my specific area of expertise. And what's at play there is the politics, the emerging politics of the North that would be oriented around the anti-slavery movement, as well as the economic realities of the South, where you actually see the free market at play. I mean, considering, unfortunately, that slaves were considered only quasi-human and chattel property, obviously something is a terrible stain on our history. The point is, the United States was the only slave society in the New World that had natural increase among its enslaved population.
That's right.
Therefore, there was this is very perverse, a market incentive for there not to be a transatlantic slave trade coming into the slave states, so that, as a result of that natural increase, plantation owners in the Upper South were able to sell their enslaved progeny to the Lower South. That, of course, coincided with the boom of cotton. And this is what the framers in the 1780s didn't know, Martin. They didn't know that that was going to happen. They didn't know there would be this technological innovation. They really believed that when the transatlantic slave trade was shut off in 1808, that about a generation later, slavery would come to an end. It was heartfelt.
That's true. There was probably some misplaced optimism there, and probably an array of factors going into the movement behind abolishing the transatlantic slave trade, moral considerations as well as more practical or maybe market ones, as you put it. Yet when we look back, or when we have these arguments in modern-day society, we look back at that era, and it's almost as if it's frozen in time. Right? And the initial compromises or protections for slavery, there are some protections in the Constitution for slavery, and there are also some aspects of the Constitution that allow the federal government to nibble at it, right, on the margins, at least at first. Those compromises overshadow emancipation. That is what I'm trying to get my mind wrapped around in the process of this series, as if there was no progress, right? Or there was no conflict. As James Oakes has put it, some people want to erase conflict from American history, and it's not just, the flag-waving crazies who only want to see heroes in George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It's happening on the left now.
There is so much in that question. Not that you need to hear
it's more of a speech, but go ahead.
No, perhaps that's why I like it. It is spot on. You don't need to hear that from me. That not only summarizes early American history, but in a lot of ways it explains the most important tension that exists in American history, so much so that it persists to this day. And it is this, that what the Constitution allowed was that there could be political conflict well before the Civil War over what to do about slavery. And in the 1820s and 30s, if you start looking at the early writings and speeches of a young politician named Abraham Lincoln, you see the emergence of what became known in the 1840s as free labor ideology. That is, right, that each human being owns his or her own labor. Certainly not revolutionary to you and me, but that was a fairly revolutionary concept. And of course, what emerged was the Kansas-Nebraska Party that became the Republican Party. I say that not to draw a modern connection to the modern Republican Party, although that could be done. I would say it instead as a historian that there were, in every decade, these conflicts. They manifested themselves in every presidential election. They manifested themselves in every presidential administration. Even if slavery wasn't the issue that explicitly was being mentioned, it was the context in which, say, westward expansion was being discussed, taxation, diplomacy, so on. All of that to say—
the tariff battle in the 1830s.
Exactly. The Emancipation Proclamation is the culmination of those conflicts. And I think what pains me the most, not just as a historian of race, but as an American who believes we ought to celebrate our pluralism, is that we don't spend the same amount of time celebrating that story as we do complaining inaccurately about the very foundation of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is the Constitution.
Well, one of my many criticisms of the 1619 Project was that it does flatten the past. The pro-slavery ideology that took root in the United States probably after the 1820s, 1830s, and of course reached its peak in the 1850s, didn't exist. That mindset didn't exist in the 1780s, 1790s. Would you agree with that?
Completely. And that shouldn't surprise us, right? Because if all of us who are part of this conversation, you and me discussing this, people listening, if we were just to stop right now and play a 30-second intellectual mental exercise and think about our political thinking 15, 20, 25 years ago, no doubt it's evolved, right? Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean that we, quote unquote, switch sides from left to right or right to left, but no doubt we can appreciate in this modern era that there's been an evolution, perhaps an evolution to the better. That, of course, goes on all the time.
Sorry to interrupt. The institution of slavery dramatically changed to help fuel that ideology.
Oh, completely. In so many respects, technological innovation. I'm a social and cultural historian, and so that's what I gravitate to in terms of the evidence. But I have to say that what prompted my interest in the evolution of African American cultures and, to your point, the evolution of the institution of slavery were two very significant technological innovations. One of them was the cotton gin, and then the one that I focused on was a similar refinement in sugar refining in the Gulf Coast. Without those, this is the point, without those, there would not have been a demand for slaves in the Lower South, and the institution would have died off.
Kate Mazer has written a marvelous book called Until Justice Be Done. Such a great book that I almost forgot the title of it. Are you familiar with this book?
I am. I'm not.
It's tremendous because she charts the progress and the regress in the civil rights movement. She dates the start of the American civil rights movement to the founding of the country. Took place more so at the state level. And most of her book is about the northern states, not about attacking slavery, about attacking inequality in those states. So when someone thinks of the civil rights movement, they're thinking in the 1960s. No, she says there were disputes over the place of black people and the interpretation of the Constitution, the Privileges and Immunities Clause right from the get-go. You lose a little of that when, like I said, you just flatten history entirely.
It's a rich history, and you're not only flattening it in terms of time, to your earlier point about erasing the conflict politically that happened socially in each generation, but you're also erasing it to the apparent thesis of that book. I've not read it, but I know who she is. You're erasing this sort of the vertical richness, which is what's going on at the federal level most often in American history is a reflection of what's happened at the local and state level.
There was a so-called federal consensus, which is not in the Constitution, which is kind of strange when we talk about a pro-slavery Constitution. The thing that defended slavery most, arguably, was the so-called federal consensus, whereby the federal government could not interfere with slavery where it already existed. I'm not sure what the origins of the federal consensus were.
One possible origin for the federal consensus is even in the debates of the 1850s, but it's articulated by politicians, perhaps well-meaning because they wanted to abolish slavery, that I say perhaps because who knows if they're accurate about this. They wanted to impose upon something in the Constitution that wasn't there. In fact, there was the absence of a federal consensus about being pro-slavery. If there was any federal consensus, it was that slavery would have to remain restricted to those territories where it existed. And then you might say, Kevin, I want to play devil's advocate. What about the Missouri Compromise? What about the Compromise of 1850? All of those use the same line of demarcation between North and South of slave and free states. It is the same consensus, which is decidedly, if not anti-slavery, anti the expansion of slavery. Therefore, if there was any consensus, it was that, not a pro-slavery one.
But if you view history as simply an unbroken line of white supremacy, right, where you are either a racist or an anti-racist, and maybe some of this is understandable given what we're going through today, but we have to be careful as people, right, not to take today's attitudes and transplant them. And another way of putting this chaotic question, Kevin, if you're either a racist or an anti-racist, you're not going to understand people like Abraham Lincoln or Ulysses S. Grant very well.
No, you can't understand anyone in history. During my days as a history professor, Martin, I always volunteered to teach the class on historical methods and historiography, two ideas that would probably bore to tears anyone who's not a historian, but it's the process by which we actually do history. And the very first week, and I think any historian who taught or teaches that class would start about teaching about the fallacy of presentism. We have the advantage not only of hindsight, but of a more advanced moral code, a greater awareness of the dignity of all human persons in the 21st century. These are good things, and by the way, we understand this most profoundly in the United States. But that's perhaps a story for another question. The point is, that's the fallacy of presentism at work, that we want to read into the 1850s or we want to read into the 1610s or the 1780s, a motivation that couldn't be there because people are products of their age.
Racial attitudes, how we would describe racism, that definition has changed over time. And I would say, not to pat myself or you on the back, we're not here to minimize. Anyone who's listened to my podcast knows never minimized the horrors of slavery. I think, in effect, we're actually recognizing it.
Yeah, quite the opposite.
The institution did become so powerful and so pervasive that this conflict culminated in a bloody civil war to ultimately end the thing.
Absolutely. And I think one of the consequences, perhaps it's unintended, I don't know, of efforts like the 1619 Project is that it prevents us from having the conversations that our system, evidenced by the Constitution, actually allows and encourages us to have. And so it is decidedly un-American. I don't mean that in a way that people who adhere to the 1619 Project have to leave America. It's just not part of our political and social fabric to avoid having these tough conversations.
Argument
They're preventing it.
That's right. Democracy is about argument.
And the confidence of our positions, right? And the reason those adherents of the 1619 Project shouldn't be confident in their position is because it's wholly historically inaccurate.
And not to get back into the 1619 thing again, I've covered it a lot, but if you can't get something as important, as of such surpassing importance as the American Revolution right, I mean, it's hard to take a project like that seriously, especially after errors are pointed out and they're still up on the New York Times website to this day. I like the New York Times. I'm an employee of the Washington Times. I read the New York Times all the time. I'm not a Times hater, but that project was not good. I mean, the idea that anyone declared or went for independence or fought the war to preserve slavery, I'm not sure where exactly they came up with that idea.
Well,
I mean, there have been some books written about it. Some people have argued. There's a book by Gerald Horne called The Counter-Revolution of 1776, arguing that, yes, indeed, the founders were doing a counter-revolution. The real revolution was the British trying to abolish slavery in the colonies. I mean, this is fantasy. But
I'm just letting you know, that's total fantasy.
Yeah.
100% fantasy, according to the historical record. I think the origins of that strain of thought, going back to the days of Marcus Garvey in the early 20th century, there's a strain in African American studies that was separatist. And I can understand the motivations of that for sure. But the point is that people trained in that very minor strain became professors in the 1960s and 1970s. And then you start having graduate students and you start seeing the explosion in studies and books. This coincided with the emergence of critical race theory generally. I'm not just talking about in reference to the United States or critical theory in reference to the United States and race. Those two combinations, critical theory and the emergence of this strain as a major strain, are now predominant in the American Academy.
I want to talk about CRT and also the Heritage Report on Monticello, Mount Vernon, etc. But one more question about Constitution and our modern-day memory of the conflict over slavery, or how that conflict has been erased. Do you believe the Garrisonian interpretation of the Constitution has had a lasting and maybe detrimental effect on how we understand anti-slavery?
I think it has. I mean, I would like to think that all of us as Americans, if we were alive with Garrison, would share his opinion and even his motivation, but even he was capable of misreading the Constitution, and he did. And I think what has happened as a result is very much connected to what I just mentioned about this once minor strain in African American studies and in American history becoming a major strain. That Garrisonian interpretation of the Constitution is one of the facets of that. It's one of the building blocks of that misreading of history.
So one area where I hear young people say this a lot, and I can understand why I say that, young people. I guess, well, I am in my mid-40s now, so, teenagers, people in their early 20s who are being introduced to American history, I can understand why it's hard for them growing up in our society today where racism, if you are a racist, that's it, right? You don't have a place in our society today. They can't get past the fact that George Washington, all these men who are heroicized, right, were hypocrites, at least when it came to their personal lives. They lived a certain way because of the labor of others. How do you respond to that? How do you introduce nuance into that type of discussion where someone says, well, George Washington, racist, slave owner, it's hard to look past that?
The first thing, and I always mean this genuinely, I understand that. I mean,
they're not wrong.
No, they're not wrong. I mean, we agree with that, right? And secondly, isn't it, I would ask this person, and I've asked many students this question who've made that claim, isn't it great we live in a country where we have come to understand that? And invariably, regardless of that student's politics, they say, sure. And I said, well, what is it about our country that allows us to celebrate that? And then now we're having a conversation, right, rather than trying to categorize the other into some hyper-politicized tribe. And once you start having that conversation about why and how it's possible for us to have this revelation, right, about every human person being equal and that slavery is a stain on America, we then start looking at history on its terms and the historical actors in history on their terms. Doesn't mean that we're excusing it. This isn't some backhanded way to whitewash history. That's what doing history is. And that's why it's really important in the interpretation of historic plantations for us to invite visitors into that process of rereading the American past with all the criticism of a flawed moral code, in the same way that people 100 years from now may do that for us. But that's what history brings to life. And we're really, to use your wonderful verb and imagery, Martin, we are flattening that process, which, by the way, coincides with a disdain that people have for studying history, and it feeds that cycle.
I hope I'm not creating a straw man about these attitudes. I think they are out there. I mean,
I don't think so. I mean, and I'm trying to be very charitable toward them. I don't
see it
think
on
it's a straw
social
man.
media
Sure.
a lot, to hell with the Constitution
Sure.
written by slaveholders. You know what I mean? I don't want to create or invent an attitude that doesn't exist, but I do see this on social media for what that's worth. So the Crt Debate, I've dipped my toes into this as well. Now, I have two nephews who go to public school in Loudoun County, Virginia, which was kind of ground zero for some of these controversies. I've talked to my nephews briefly about this. They, of course, don't know what critical race theory is. They're not being taught critical race theory in their introductory history classes in grade school. So what's going on here? Is it a lens that the school district is applying to the way they approach social studies? I'm not quite sure what the issue is.
I think to understand critical race theory, a couple of points need to be made. The first is a brief explanation about its history, and then the second is a caveat. The brief explanation is, like with everything else that ends up, every other educational approach that ends up in the K through 12 classroom, it is something that started in American higher ed. That's how we train and certify teachers. And so critical theory has been around since the 1940s and 50s. And
It's an academic methodology.
Yeah, exactly. And, parts of it are helpful. Critical race theory, I think, has some severe limitations. But the second point, which is a caveat, is that when most Americans hear the phrase critical race theory, they hear something that's innocuous. They hear something that means, oh, we're going through history and telling the real story about some really difficult chapters. That's not what critical race theory is. What they think they're hearing is what you call history. What critical race theory is, it is a neo-Marxist methodology or approach. I don't mean that to be pejorative, but to be explanatory, which defines people according to the immutable characteristic of the color of their skin. I think, and thankfully a lot of people believe, that actually undermines the dignity of the human person, because we're a lot more than just the color of our skin. That is the most noble of all of the ideals of America. So to your question about your nephews and what's going on in secondary schools, critical race theory was once an approach, but now it has books, and now it has a whole set of curricula that if they're not present in Loudoun County, I can assure you they're present in several hundred school districts in the country.
Well, I think it's impossible to know for sure, because there are thousands of school districts. Places do things differently, right? So maybe it exists some places, maybe it doesn't. Here's my problem with the moral panic over CRT, because a lot of the people who said they were against it didn't know what they were talking about either. So here is my concern. Let's just use the example of my nephews there in Loudoun County as a potential chilling effect on teachers, right? They begin to learn about the history of slavery in Virginia, how Virginians, their most profitable export was human beings. After the end of the international slave trade, Virginians began to sell their slaves into the Deep South to King Cotton, right? They go home, they show my brother what they learned. Now, my brother wouldn't do this. He says, this is what you're learning in class. He calls up the school district and complains. I'm making a caricature here a little bit.
That's a straw man, which I know you're not trying to do intentionally.
That's right. That's what I'm concerned about, that parents are going to overreact to something that's really just the teaching of history.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important for, and I don't mean to celebrate what Heritage is doing necessarily, but it's so important for institutions like the Heritage Foundation to publish in this. It's not tax policy, it's not even education system policy, it's the policy of how we learn about the past so that we educate parents. I know we're just using your brother as a hypothetical. In that hypothetical, that's not critical race theory.
No, it isn't,
That's
but
history.
someone might think it is, and it could be a chilling effect on teachers not to bring this stuff up.
Yeah, but I don't mean this to be argumentative.
No, you
maybe,
can argue.
maybe
Go
a little
ahead.
bit. I think it's abusive to cite that example when probably 100 times more frequent is that your brother hypothetically would hear his children come home and they say, Dad, guess what happened to me in first grade? Black kids got put in one group, I got put in another group, and I've been labeled an oppressor. That's not a hypothesis. That has happened tens of thousands of times in this country, Martin. That is unacceptable. It is un-American. It is unjust. It's evil, and we have to root it out.
So there are two issues at play here then. We're talking about the legitimate teaching of history. You're saying we don't have to worry about that. We have to worry about this other stuff.
That's right.
Okay. So Heritage Foundation came out with a report about Monticello, Montpelier, and Mount Vernon. Now, I read your report. I have not been to Montpelier ever, so I can't comment on the report's findings. I haven't been to Mount Vernon in several years, so I'll stay away from there. But I do go to Monticello every year.
Why would you stay away from Mount Vernon? It's the best of the
it's great, but I just haven't been there in a while. Well, maybe because it's the pandemic. Although I did go there to watch Joseph Ellis speak recently, but that was at night and just in the auditorium. So I don't purposely.
I'll let you ask your question. I'm just a big proponent, actually, of going to all three in spite of the warts of two of them. But Mount Vernon is, of course, wonderful place and very well interpreted.
I go to Monticello every September for my birthday. Jefferson, I won't say he's my favorite founder. He is the most fascinating of all the founders, in my view. I love his provocative broadsides against organized religion in churches, as a non-believer myself, and a staunch believer in the separation of church and state. I have a couple of books sitting next to me here as I speak to you, The Hemings of Monticello, a marvelous book by Annette Gordon-Reed, as well as American Sphinx by Joseph Ellis, who takes down Jefferson a few notches in this book. So, to my question. Well, I read the report, and I found the complaints about Monticello to be a little bit bizarre. We'll start with the report claiming that Monticello overemphasizes slavery and de-emphasizes Jefferson's accomplishments politically. I don't know. You go into the house tour. Everyone wants to see the house. So it is going to be the shortest of the tours, right? They have to whisk people in and out of there. It would be strange if you went into the beautiful library or the entrance room or wherever, the living room, the dining room, and they started talking about Jefferson's presidency, which he did not enjoy. He was in Monticello mostly in his retirement. I want to hear about the house. I don't need to hear about the Declaration of Independence. He wrote that in Philadelphia. That was less a question. Sorry, it's a word salad.
I think your critique, which I know is passed along with a lot of thought because you go to Monticello, is bizarre, frankly. And I don't mean that in a defensive way about a heritage research product. We're confident enough in our research products not to be that way. What I mean is what has happened over the last decade is a hyper-politicization of the interpretation of Monticello. I grant you the point that people want to go to Monticello, they want to see the house. But what's happened is you sort of think about it as an old-fashioned scale, is that in an attempt to cast Jefferson's slave-owning past in the most unfavorable light, it's disproportionate in the time that's spent interpreting. And so as a historian and actually someone who's not only written a lot of exhibits, but almost all of them have been on the interpretation of race and of slavery at places like Monticello, not as famous for sure. Mm-hmm. I always wanted to pay attention to that balance because what happens is if we present that where, 2/3 of the information you get at Monticello now is about the enslaved persons, obviously nothing against them, and I'm not opposed to interpreting that, you have taken away the time to talk about what Jefferson offered not just to the United States, but what he offered to free people around the world. That has always, I would argue, must have a place at Monticello, and it doesn't today.
I don't know. I've never come away from there feeling like they've neglected that. Now, that could be because I've read a lot about Jefferson, so this stuff is bouncing around in my head while I'm there.
I think the way to, and again, I
mean this could be eye of the beholder. I don't have a problem with how they...
Perhaps it's the teacher in me, and not the college professor, but the teacher, having opened a K-12 school, that when I go to Monticello or Montpelier or Mount Vernon, I sort of see it through the eyes of a 6th grader or a 7th grader. And, I have kids that age, and I know the kinds of things they pick up on. I'm grateful, I want to be really clear, that Monticello, starting in about 2000, started to do a much better job of interpreting the lives of enslaved persons.
It is a plantation.
My point is that in the last 5 or 8 years, and I think our study does a marvelous job of this, is that we show the profound amount of money that's gone in to impose presentism on Monticello. And it's done that at the expense of someone whose contributions to the very ideal of freedom, ironically, is the owner of the plantation. That's what's bizarre to me.
Give me an example of where you think presentism has reared its head there.
Let's see, it's been a couple years since I've taken the tour, so I might have this 10 or 20% off. I would say in a general sense that the amount of time that they spend interpreting slavery there, in particular, the philosophical hypocrisy or contradictions of Jefferson, that's like 3 or 4 times the amount of time they spend talking about Jefferson interpreting the Declaration, period.
I think each tour guide in your report references this. Each tour guide is different. You may have a tour guide who spends more or less time on
Having been a tour
issues.
guide, I can attest to that.
There is a museum where you get a lot more of these other things, not just the slavery. Jefferson's architecture. You can see how he lived his life with the basement, right, and all the things, his contraptions, his inventions, the way he produced wine and beer, all these things. So some of those things are certainly not neglected.
Well, those are neat and cute, but they're minuscule compared to the contributions that are being undermined by the overemphasis on aspects of his life that we need to talk about. But my point is not to the degree that we do for the sake of historical balance. That's what's being distorted.
This is his home, right, where he lived mostly in his retirement. So to Jefferson himself, his presidency was not one of the highlights of his career.
Well, I mean, I'm enjoying the conversation,
But it's not on his gravestone.
Including the verbal sparring. Yeah. That's immaterial to me. As a civil society, we recognize that his presidency was very important. His writing the Declaration was very important, including to him. And neither is presented with any balance anymore at Monticello. But I think perhaps the helpful thing, maybe you can keep in mind the next time you go to Monticello, is that
I'll be there in a couple of weeks.
Good, and happy birthday. Yeah. That when you're enjoying the tour, and I hope that you do, keep in mind that no longer do American schools teach us about Jefferson. In fact, I could cite to you, if I had been prepared to do so, the 9 or 10 most popular textbooks in American history classes that barely mention him. That's the problem, is that when you combine those two things, you can see the agenda that's there. And I think Monticello is a reflection of the agenda.
I'll grant you this. Maybe they are overcorrecting after not spending enough time on this. So Sally Hemings, right? Your report talks about Sally Hemings. It references the fact that there's some disagreement about whether she was Jefferson's concubine, which was the 18th century way of saying substitute wife. I'll give you Joseph Ellis from his book, which is highly critical of Jefferson, and the initial edition was written prior to the DNA testing, establishing the link between Jefferson and Eston Hemings, one of Sally's children. Here is Joseph Ellis saying the likelihood of a long-standing sexual relationship between Jefferson and Hemings can never be proven absolutely, but it is now proven beyond a reasonable doubt. I also have here Annette Gordon Reed's book, The Hemingses of Monticello. She not only deals with the DNA evidence, but a mountain of circumstantial evidence that if it's not Thomas Jefferson, I don't see who else it could be. Now, I know there's theories out there that it was Jefferson's brother. I think there are a lot of people who are simply uncomfortable with the idea of Thomas Jefferson, American hero, taking a black slave girl as his concubine.
Oh, no doubt. Now, by the way, I happen to agree with Ellis and Reed, and the DNA testing makes it, again, it's not without doubt, but I've taught students every class I've ever taught. I've said that, and this dates back to the time before we had the DNA testing as well, that Hemings most likely, was Jefferson's concubine. I don't mean this to be sarcastic. So what? I mean, I'm a historian of race and of plantation owners and of their enslaved persons primarily. That happened all the time. I don't say that to excuse that. You understand that. I'm not being dismissive. What I'm saying is that's not the news. The news is Jefferson, like every other person that's ever walked the planet except one, was flawed. And let's tell that story. But in order to tell that story, what Monticello is doing is telling only one side of the equation, which, to emphasize, must be told, but not telling enough of the other side of the equation, which must be told. And that's the problem.
The other side is the Declaration.
The Declaration is, for that matter, his time in France as a diplomat. These are crucial contributions to the United States.
Yeah, it's hard to fit all of that in a short house tour, especially.
I've written the Martin. It isn't.
I find all of these things about Jefferson's personal life to make him more interesting.
Oh, he's fascinating.
The idea that, now, if we were to go back in time, we would also be able to then prove what happened there between Sally and Thomas, if anything. But if we were to go back in time to this plantation in the 1820s, we would see Jefferson, the aging lion in winter. We would see his white daughter and white grandchildren and these mixed race children, and would probably be the thing that hit us the most, right, in the face, right? That's what we'd be focusing on. So when I go to Monticello today, I like that almost immersive experience, what it would have been like to see that.
I don't know why that immersive experience, which is a great way to interpret a historic house museum is mutually exclusive in your mind from telling the other side of his life. And for us as a civil society, it's important, as we make sure we are reading the past correctly, not to overcorrect to the point that we are denigrating contributions that are timeless.
So what's the answer here to all these problems? Some have said we need to re-emphasize civics education. Of course, trying to get Americans today to decide on what should be in a civics curriculum is rather difficult. Some people are working on it. I mean, this is not the first time it's been tried. What is the Heritage Foundation view on what should be in a civics curriculum?
It needs to start with political philosophy. And obviously, if it's an advanced class, that can go in greater depth, but you can begin teaching those principles even in elementary grades. And secondly, you have to teach in civics well before you teach the fashionable action civics, which is really just how to be a radical leftist agitator, the nuts and bolts of how government works. And, by literally every objective measure, the civics knowledge of American children and American adults has declined over the last 25 years.
I think fundamentally, I won't comment on the radical leftist agitator comment.
I was trying to trigger you.
Well, I don't know where that's happening. Maybe it is. I guess
really?
In colleges, maybe.
You're going to hop in my diesel truck one day, my friend, and I'm going to take you around to some school districts and show you.
Well, I graduated Ithaca College, a very liberal school with a radical politics department. I graduated there in the 1990s, 97.
So you just named one.
No one ever tried to make me into any type of agitator, but I did have really good new left revisionist history professors.
Well, actually, let me hang on that point if you don't mind.
Sure.
And again, for explanation, in state legislatures like the Texas legislature, I've spent a lot of time advocating for good civics instruction. We kept running up against what's called action civics, and the headline is action civics is really just radical leftist agitation.
Well, I can't say that I know what's going on in the education sphere. I don't want anyone to think I know what I'm talking about there. That's why I'm asking you these questions. I haven't been in a classroom in a long time. So you're right, Americans and kids, I find this really depressing. At a fundamental level, they don't even know how basic government function, how the Constitution is amended, how many people are on the Supreme Court, who is on the Supreme Court. Can you name a Supreme Court ruling? There was a recent C-SPAN poll about this. Name Supreme Court rulings. Most people said Brown versus Board of Ed, Roe versus Wade, and they could not name anything else.
It's depressing, isn't it? That's something that should concern us wherever we are in the political spectrum.
Regardless, right? Yes. We all should know at least a little bit about. I think what it does, it creates a cynicism about government. Now, I know that the Heritage Foundation doesn't want the government to do too much. It's fostering a climate where people don't think the government can or should do anything. The government is the enemy.
Yeah, I don't think the government's the enemy, although there are aspects of the government being the enemy that if this were a policy show, we talk about. In other words, the Heritage Foundation...
Government gets a lot of stuff wrong, but we also know from history that it can get some stuff right.
Right, that's what I was about to say. And yet, just to hang on the point, there are aspects of the government, especially the surveillance state, that's really problematic. And it used to be that both the American left and the American right would agree on that. But to your larger point or question, what is the Heritage Foundation doing? Well, we want a right-sized federal government with right-sized state governments. Obviously, a lot of leeway if you look at the 50 states to develop the priorities they want in terms of policy. If we could just get back to federalism, where states have a lot more leeway to make the decisions they want in policy, obviously the federal government ought to have some of the role that it does. It shouldn't be as expensive or as large or as intrusive into our lives, according to our worldview, then that would be good.
Let's end with this. On the subject of early American history and slavery, which books would you recommend to our listeners?
You mentioned a couple of good ones. I'm a big believer in reading biographies because if they're written well, and there are many great ones, you can really get a good sense of the richness of relationships. And so I'm in the middle of rereading Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton, who's not come up in our conversation, and that's fine, but he does play a real important role in this. David McCullough, unfortunately, died recently. Yeah. He has a great biography of John Adams. His 1776 is masterful. Ellis's Founding Brothers is wonderful, but I think the single most informative book for me in my history work was The Radicalism of the American Revolution by Gordon Wood.
Yes. You had to read all the classics. You had to go through the canon to get your PhD. So you know Bernard Bailyn, Gordon Wood.
Did some seminars with Bernard Bailyn, which is just...
Wow.
Yeah, and at Cambridge and in the UK. He used to do this transatlantic history seminar, and it was one of the capstones of my career as an early historian.
Wow. I'm jealous. The ideological chronological origins of the American Revolution that's ground zero.
It is.
If I had to suggest one book to someone who didn't know anything about the American Revolution, I might give them that.
You know, that's a really good idea, because I suggest Gordon Wood's book a lot, but it's a bit of a tome, whereas, and nothing against Wood, obviously, but Balin's is succinct.
Radicalism of the American Revolution, also incredible. Thank you, Kevin.
This has been a pleasure. Thanks, Martin.
Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation. And check out the report we discussed. It's titled A Tale of Three Presidential Houses, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's available online. Read it for yourself and see what you think. Also, Washington Times reporter Sean Saleh wrote an article about it. You can find that at washingtontimes.com. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll return to the subject of war. Russia's war in Ukraine, the U.S. failure in Afghanistan, the French in Algeria. There's a pattern here. War doesn't work, so why do countries keep trying it? We'll be joined by Sir Lawrence Freedman next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.